So welcome to you all on this sixth webinar on ThriveAbility. We started with Rethinking Economics, and in the meantime, Restory joined us, and also Imagine Life as organizers of the event tonight. And we started with webinars on ThriveAbility. With as first speaker, we had Michelle Holliday, author of The Age of ThriveAbility. So that was a very good start. Afterwards, we had also Daniel Christian Waal, who we interviewed for Rethinking Economics, talking about regenerative economy and bioregions. We had Kees Klomp and Shinta Oosterwaal, who are the authors of a book that will appear next week, in which Ralph also wrote a chapter. We interviewed Hans Klaus, who's a director of a prison and who has a very special way of looking at freedom and how prisons should be organized. And lately, the fifth speaker we had was Tristan Dissot from Brussels, who spoke about the application of the donut economics in Brussels. Tonight, we are very pleased and happy to have as a guest Ralph Thurm, who I'm going to ask to introduce himself a bit. We will be talking roughly about 50 minutes. It will be an interview style in which we're going to ask him a bit about his book, about his view on sustainability and regenerative business. Afterwards, we're going to invite you listeners to answer 2 questions in the chat box. And then afterwards, we're going to go in small breakout rooms. In these breakout rooms, you will have the chance to reflect on the things you heard, what Ralph said and shared. And after the breakout rooms, at the end, we come back and we're going to ask a resume from some of the breakout rooms, and then we have a Q&A. The idea is to end maximum at 10 o'clock in the evening. So that's going to be already quite a long period of time. We hope that you've brought your own booze with you, because it's yeah, so cheers. Yeah, so you don't see and I apologize for my voice, but I got a cold 2 days ago, and I'm trying to survive, but I will. So this is the setup for tonight. We have people from all over the globe, so that's interesting. We're going to involve you too. So, but let's start with it. Ralph, we had a small intake last week, but what interests me, and probably also the audience, is tell us about who you are, your journey, your passion, and what is, according to you, most relevant for us to know in the setting of this evening.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eddie, and welcome also from my side. It's great that you spend the evening with us and not preferring Netflix over this session. It's wonderful to have you, and I hope it will be very fruitful and with lots of learning, of course. Well, who am I? I'm Ralph Thurm, as already mentioned. I'm a born German. I do live in the Netherlands for about 19 years now. I'm an economist by education. I studied at the University of Nuremberg in Germany. And what actually brought me to sustainability was the fact that I studied 1998 to 1989 to 1992 in Nuremberg in Germany. And 2 events were surrounding my economic studies. The first one was the release of the Brundtland report in 1987, which has very much sort of inspired me to think about the connection between sustainable development and economic theory, and vice versa. How could economic theory also make contribution to sustainable development? And the other event was 1992. I was just about to write my diploma thesis. The first Rio conference happened, which was really the first international gathering around sustainable development. And so here I was, an economics student right in between, and trying to really embed sustainability into economic theory, or at least the basic thinking. And I was also the first actually to write a diploma thesis about how to integrate sustainability into accounting. And I'm not aware that anybody before me actually ever covered that issue. It actually led me to work for one of the big multinationals, for Siemens, for around about 10 years. In the first couple of years, it was really about caring about environmental topics with an economic background. So it was still the end of the pipe to the beginning of the pipe time, when it was about waste and wastewater pollution and emissions and technical features, how to reduce that. And during that time, due to my economic know-how and things like activity-based costing and so on, I was able to reveal through sort of backcasting from what I saw, what came out as waste in all different sorts through production, how much was already procured upfront that in the end ends up in waste. And that helped me to lever an awful lot of potential financially and help the company to save in 1 year about 680 million euros, just by looking at things from backwards to the front. But I was then also asked to come to Munich, to the headquarters of Siemens, to actually work on that globally and also to develop a first sustainability strategy for Siemens. And when you talk to 190 countries on this planet where this big company felt, as it called itself, at home, you get 250 different opinions what sustainability is. So it's very, very difficult to really get sort of vocabulary and structure into the development of a company strategy, because that's also the sort of all the cultural implications that also play a role. And during that time, I got in touch with an organization that is called the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. For all of those who read sustainability reports, or so-called sustainability reports, I think we're still going to cover that, Eddie, later on. The GRI is the, so to say, standard, how to write sustainability reports. And I was there right from the start as a European industry expert. And then in 2002, actually, when GRI came to the Netherlands to be a foundation under Dutch law, I was asked to join them. And this is the reason why we as a family live in the Netherlands since 2002. So for 19 years already. And under my leadership, the second and third generation of the GRI guidelines were developed. One of the things that is really crucial is really what defines sustainability really. And one of the things that I very much care about is what is called sustainability context. And so we also, I'm pretty sure we will cover what's the problem with sustainability context nowadays and what doesn't work. But just to prompt you to that forthcoming discussion today. After my time at GRI, I worked at Deloitte for about 5 years, really setting up one of the major assurance provider firms to, I would say, truly understand what sustainability is, and that it's more than just the assurance of sustainability reports. And then 2012 happened. That was the Rio +20 conference. So 20 years after the first Rio conference, there was a second Rio conference. And our government leaders decided that we wanted a regenerative and distributive economy. So, and that was actually named in an outcome document that was called The Future We Want. And some of us who were busy with sustainability right from the start, we looked at each other and we said, well, unfortunately, that's going to take forever. It's not the future we want. It is the future that we design as humans in the Anthropocene. So who's going to do that job? Who's going to design what is absolutely necessary to come to a regenerative and distributive economy? And we looked at reporting standards. We looked at management system standards. We looked at policy standards. We looked at all sorts of financial benchmarks. And the answer was none of that will deliver. None of that. So the question was, okay, so are we seeing signals that somebody is actually really doing the job? And unfortunately, we didn't see anyone. The only thing that you heard was, oh, you know, we're doing like incremental steps in the right direction, and then maybe somehow magically we'll come there. Or there is major technological innovation, and that will save the planet. Well, I don't believe in any of that. And so we actually pulled the the thing by the horns, so to say, and began to sort of define what is it that we're then going to do. And the first thing that we did was to really look at what is this, a regenerative and distributive economy? What is the sort of ideal that it would be like? What are the features, the principles, the processes we need in that? And that was really the sort of soul searching to a certain degree, because it was not just technical processes or economic processes. It was also had very much to do with the human being itself. That has to do with the fact that we, over the last 20 years, coming from the Brundtland report, actually reduced the term sustainability to a comic version of it. You know, originally it was really called people, planet, and prosperity. Prosperity is a way to express the well-being of human beings to a certain degree. And it became people, planet, and profit over the years, because it just fitted the corporate sector better, and the sort of quarterly reporting or the yearly reporting, if you want. And the other thing that we sort of out-engineered was the idea of what in the Brundtland report is called intra- and intergenerational equity. There's a very famous sentence in the Brundtland report that says, don't do anything in your generation that would reduce the next generations to have at least the same possibilities than your generation has. They have better words for that, but that's actually what it means. And we have actually totally ignored that. And that is the most important principle around sustainability from my perspective. This is what really defines sustainability, in a balance between humans and the planet. And the Brundtland report was all about the human and the human being finding back the balance to the planet. And that question we totally out-engineered. You very often hear environmental groups talking about we need to save the planet. No, we don't. The planet does wonderfully without us. It is saving us as a human race on this planet, and redefine what that balance is. So that is all part of what we thought through in that backcasting of what a regenerative and distributive economy is. And then defined a work ecosystem at R3.0, which we can, of course, later on cover as well, because we're still in the introduction of the session.
What I wanted to ask you something, because I know you've given now your professional background and how you moved from companies to companies and organizations. But I think I remember you told me that during your travels for Siemens and GRI, you also always took a weekend extra. And you did some interesting stuff. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, you know, I knew from my very early readings of sustainability and really not harming the planet, I knew that my travels at GRI and my travels at Siemens would cause environmental harm. Just simply my own footprint, my environmental footprint, of course, added up. And the idea that I had right from the start was very much, you know, if it's about creating balances, what is it that I can give back? And one of the things that I did and made that sort of a habit, because I was traveling quite a bit during those years at Siemens and at GRI, and to a certain degree still in my years for Deloitte, but that was more in the EMEA region, just to add a weekend or a couple of days to my business trips. And most likely those would be the weekends where you would not work for your company as well. But by doing that, you're actually made the trip cheaper for your company, because you have less of these short-term trips, and prices for tickets just went down by 50% if you stayed a couple of days longer. So what I actually did is that I try to connect already beforehand with local NGOs. Knowing that, you know, our Western world impact on the rest of the world is immense, and really wanting to know firsthand what that means. You know, all that shipping of our waste to the Philippines or to other countries in Southeast Asia, or what are the pandemic and epidemic consequences of our doing in the Western world. And Two examples that I may want to mention. One is that in the early 2000s, where AIDS was still an epidemic in Africa, and especially in the southern part of Africa, I collaborated with Doctors Without Borders locally. And I told them, I'm here, I'm going to stay for another weekend. I do want to help. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a human being. So what can I do? And what they told me was, yes, of course, you're not a doctor, but we need helping hands. Just imagine, we have little kids here who lost both of their parents to AIDS. They're alone. There's nobody there for them. And these kids will die. And, there were cases where they told me, we have a couple of kids here that will not survive the next night. We don't have the time to do a lot with them, but, if you can come and just be there for them, take them by the hand, just give them hugs, be there and give them a decent opportunity and probably make them smile. Play with them, talk with them if you can. They will not understand you, but they will be very happy to hear your voice. And so I did that actually twice, and have the experience of dying kids in my arms, knowing that they had no chance in life due to an epidemic that they haven't caused. And it is like a picture of many in the Southern Hemisphere who are most suffering from the unsustainability of the Northern Hemisphere die or suffer of something that they haven't caused. So that was one example. And the other one actually was in the Philippines, where I was traveling for GRI. Also worked with Doctors Without Borders. And there are these huge waste piles, these huge waste mountains where these little kids work with their fingers to actually deconstruct our old televisions and old computers and old telephones to take out valuable minerals. And often they do that by burning. And apart from apart from the smoke that they, inhale, their fingers are just burnt. So Doctors Without Borders has these mobile tents that, especially in the evenings, goes there and offers these little kids the opportunities to get their wounds cleaned and get some relief from their pain. So that was another thing that I was doing around about 2006, that was. So that sort of own experience gives you a very hands-on sort of emotional bonding to that sort of shit what's going on in the world and that we cause, not individually, but in totality. And if you have the idea that we have gotten any better with that, forget it. It's going on. It's continuing. It's still continuing. People die from our old bullshit stuff. So
could that be because there is a kind of dominant story today that makes us live in such a way? So what's your opinion?
Well, it has to do, it is just the economic system logic that we have. And looking at, the book that you don't see sharp now, that I wrote, I looked a little bit more deeper into the economic system malfunctioning, and we can definitely touch a little bit more on that later on in the call. But now coming back to your last part of the question, now that I told about R3.0 and about my earlier career and having used the Corona time and also the logic of Corona to write about what can we learn from Corona for the envisioning of a new normal for regeneration and thriving. That is actually what the book covers. You asked, what is really most relevant for you guys to know about me. And I think there are two or three characteristics that I want to mention. One is that I am what I call a positive maverick. I'm running against windmills on a daily basis. I have a bloody nose. I have scars on my back. These are all wounds from my past, but I see them as medals. I have actually tried for myself to define how to make a real difference. And what I'd always try to do, in our times, we have an awful lot of negative energy coming from many, many different things. And what I try to do as a positive maverick, I try to turn this around to positive energy and really trying to use this energy for the sort of activism that's needed. And that's already the second point which I wanted to mention. Everything that I do and everything that I'm thinking about is actually based on that ideal of a regenerative and distributive economy. And I differentiate myself by saying, I'm guided by what I think is necessary. I'm not guided by what is politically opportune or just simply practically possible. That is what I'm not interested in, because this is part of the killing. This sort of incremental steps in the right direction won't get us to where we need to be in the available amount of time. So I define myself as somebody who always thinks from the perspective of what's necessary. And I already mentioned the other thing, what's really guiding me as well is this idea from the Brundtland report about intergenerational equity and sustainability context that I have already also mentioned, is just one way of translating intergenerational equity into what's needed. So this is what differentiates myself.
You mentioned to me something your father said to you and also something your son said to you. I don't know if you remember.
Yes, of course. It's the epilogue. It's the epilogue that's also in the book. Yeah. It is a story that has a huge amount of motivation for me. You should know that my father was born in 1930, and he's German. Of course, he was German. He was born into the Second World War. And at the age of 9, when the turmoil really started, my grandparents actually sent him to a Hitler school in the Bavarian Alps, knowing that he had a good sort of idea of values and that he would be far away from wherever the war scenes would be. And of course, there's also the danger of, sort of brainwash and all of those things. But my grandparents simply trusted that he would withstand, at least in a diplomatic way. And I had a lot of discussions with my father in his last decade of his life. He died eight years ago, when I wanted to know more about that time. And also the burning question for me is, why didn't you withstand, or what did you do? And the standard answer for my father very often was, we didn't know about all of those things that happened. And that was sort of end of the story. And I was always dissatisfied with that. And one day I had another one of those discussions together with my son, Jan, who by that time was 14 or 15. I don't remember exactly. And we had this discussion, and my son came to me that same evening, and he was saying, Dad, I'm listening to that discussion that you have with your father about the Second World War. You know what? Whenever the time comes that we will have a discussion about the war of your generation with this planet, there's one thing that I don't want to hear from you. And that is, I didn't know all about it. And that, from a 14 or 15-year-old boy saying that to his father, making that sort of transition from the Second World War to a war of our generation, it actually shocked me. I had never expected something like that coming out of the mouth of my son. And what I realized at that time is that, of course, I do know all about it. But with knowing comes responsibility. And that means I need to look into the mirror and tell myself that I have done the utmost stinking best that I can do in my lifetime to allow this generation, this next generation, to have the same opportunities that my generation had, and which were sort of destroying on a daily basis. So that to me was huge motivation to, and that was around about 2010 or so, it must have been. And in 2012, I started R3.0, and so the story goes.
Where does the R3.0 stands for?
R3.0 actually stands for redesign for resilience and regeneration. That's the R3 part. There's still the .0 part. And .0 means that the minimum that we need to achieve is actually no negative impact or zero negative impact. So from that perspective, that is really what the R3.0 stands for. And it started earlier as R3, as reporting 3.0. That was the starting point of the thinking. How would reporting look if it fitted the idea of a regenerative and distributive economy? But we very, very quickly found out that there is a whole set of enablers that is necessary and topics that need to simultaneously leapfrog to get us to the possibility or to that necessary leapfrog to a regenerative and distributive economy. Mm-hmm. And Eddie, if it's helpful, I can mention what these topics are if you want.
Xenia, can we go back to seeing Ralph? Thank you for sharing the slide. Yeah, okay. Because it brings, I mean, the series that we're talking about is ThriveAbility. It's also the baseline in your book, Envisioning a New Normal for Regeneration and Driving. So we would really appreciate it if you could explain us these terms, also the 3 R's.
Yeah, okay. Maybe just very quickly, seeing how to best sort of structure this point. Maybe it does make sense to look at it from the perspective of all of the things that are not working at this moment in our economic system, because we're talking about a regenerative and distributive economy, which in the end needs to lead to what we call thriving, and others may call it more flourishing. So it's the idea that everybody on this world can live a decent life in well-being. And that's much more than just regeneration. So that's regeneration and thriving. And maybe I'll do it this way, that I say, if you think about sustainability and what it is, to me, it is really the dividing line between degeneration on the destructive part and regeneration on the adding part. And right where that point is, you reach basic sustainability. You have no zero or no negative impact on the environment, on other people, on other humans, and you're crossing that line from less degeneration to more regeneration. And that is also very much what we at this moment simply don't know. And maybe it's useful to explain that whole conundrum around ESG in that sense. We had started sustainability with the idea of what the Brundtland report really said. But then you need to prove that you're doing that in that way. So you need to prove that your performance to whatever you do in whatever topic actually is not harming, is not harmful, or that it actually adds a positive impact, or how we would call it system value. So without becoming too technical in these things, but think about just simply about an indicator. An indicator has a numerator and it has a denominator. So whatever a sustainability indicator is, it will have a numerator and a denominator as well. What companies do at this moment is that they measure their performance. Emissions, water, waste, effluence, biodiversity, human rights, social rights, anti-corruption, the whole thing. And they report that in so-called sustainability reports. And what they say is that, our performance has become better. We have less waste, less emissions, less human rights abuses, less cases of corruption, and all of this. But the big question in the room is, when do I know that that is sustainable? When do I know that this is minimally good enough? At this moment, no idea. I don't know. I just hear them saying that they became less bad in what they did. But do they answer the question, what is minimally good enough? No, they don't. And that is what they do. Think again from the indicator side, they just do numerator management. Numerator is giving you the performance information, and because of the lack of a denominator, they compare it to earlier years, the last year, the last 3 years, maybe an industry average or something like that. That's what companies, at 99.7% of all companies, do.
So it's not enough for you?
No, it means these reports are not sustainability reports. They are ESG progress reports. And ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance topics.
You call it La La Land, no?
I call it ESG La La Land simply because they all say, oh, our sustainability performance. No, it's not. It's just a productivity or efficiency measure that they report. So in order to cure that and to cross that line to sustainability and possibly later to regeneration and thriving, they need a denominator. They need to tell us, and these are two very important technical terms, about their thresholds and allocations. Thresholds is, for all of those that read Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, she would call it the carrying capacities. How much is there still to have for us in order to not cross the line to a 1.5 degree global warming planet world? In emission terms, it would mean we still have 420 gigatons of CO2 to emit before we actually cross that threshold. And we have, given what the world emits on average per year, the IPCC tells us this is the budget for the next 6 years. And if we cross that line in 6 years and still emit carbon, a 1.5 degree planet will become impossible. And what the IPCC also says, it's not just no emissions. We actually need to reduce our emissions by 135%. So we actually do not only have no emissions, we actually need to take out 30% more emissions out of the atmosphere during that time in order to still be intergenerally in equity terms, which means a 1.5 degree planet, which is what scientists tell us is the threshold. This is the carrying capacity that we as humans still have in order to be in balance with the planet.
So what Greta Thunberg is declaring is something you support?
Oh, absolutely. She's saying our corporate leaders and our government leaders are just telling blah, blah, blah. And that's exactly what's happening. But I just want to come back to that second term, allocations, just because it is so important. So if you have your threshold and based on the carrying capacity, the question still remains, what is the fair share for you of that? And that is what is called an allocation. And the allocation, that's the denominator. So you want to know if a company says, I'm emitting 20,000 tons of CO2 per year, and that's 2,000 tons less than last year. Well, I became better. I want to know, yeah, but what is your allocation? How much are you actually allowed to emit to still be in line with your allocation, which is based on the carrying capacity or the budget that you're allowed to emit. And those thresholds and allocations, that is really something that we technically work on at R3.0 at this moment, to really get us to that point where ESG progress reports have a chance to truly become sustainability reports. And that dividing line, where you know that you're within or without your allocation, that is the divider between less degenerational impacts or regenerative impacts.
Do you make the split between the north and the south? Sometimes I hear from students, yeah, but you in the north, you're well developed. We in the south, we still need to develop.
Well, to a certain degree, that's right. Allocations are also very much regionally different. And that is the big elephant in the room. That is what you would expect from a COP26 happening, that these things are politically discussed, and that there is a conventionalization of what's still allowed to allocate in the Northern Hemisphere. We will need to do way, way more, and even reduce our allocations even way more in order to allow the South to have a proper allocation. But those allocations need to be set, and we need international discourses for that. And that is what our political systems just simply can't deliver on. And where I have extreme doubts that politics as we know them will actually be helpful in a regenerative and distributive economy, So I just wanted to make you understand where's this crossing line between unsustainable and sustainability towards regeneration and thriving. It needs an information infrastructure so that companies are able to tell that. And honestly speaking, companies are mostly not interested in that because they would be caught with their pants down. They would very clearly be told that their business model is unsustainable and unbearable for future generations, intergenerational equity, and even unbearable for many parts of the Southern Hemisphere, and even not bearable for our part of the universe in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're sort of muddling through and stay very cloudy and have a lot of great marketing terms like net zero, for example, which is the buzzword at COP26 at the moment, and it's a scam. It is a scam. Net zero will not get us to sustainability at all. So we're starting this whole COP with the wrong starting point on when you understand sustainability context and when you understand the IPCC report. And then you hear articles in The Guardian where sponsors of this event are whining because they don't get exclusivity rights. And you already see that the public transport in Glasgow will be on strike during the whole COP. Imagine the disaster that this COP will be like. I recommend you to not expect any fruitful outcome from this conference.
For the audience, so COP26, this 26th gathering of the world leaders to discuss climate change will take place in Glasgow. And indeed, what you say, it's an important meeting, given they do something, and that's questionable if that's going to happen then. Yeah. You've spoken to me also about the word leadership, which you don't like so much. What do we need then? I mean, what kind of replacement for leadership do we need?
Well, there are, in the R3.0 world, we have started to very deeply think about some of the terms, and many of them come from the old economic or from our old normal, which people still want to see as the remaining normal. And before I come to these terms, I may very quickly say a couple of characteristics of our current economic system, and that explains why we need these new terms. And this is not just vocabulary bullshit. There's an awful lot of deep thinking behind that. So we need to recognize that our current economic system is still colonial style and oppressive by design. if you just look at the discussion that we had about sharing COVID vaccination with the global South, this is a wonderful example of Northern Hemisphere colonial style politics. So, and we have that all the time, the whole outsourcing to other parts of the world, the human rights and labor rights abuses in many parts of the world that are just overlooked by us in the Northern Hemisphere, and they need to deal with that. It is mainly caused by the economic system inequality that we in the Northern Hemisphere have caused. So our economic system is colonial style and oppressive. It is also racist and ignorant to minority groups. The whole LGBT discussion, the whole Black Lives Matter developments. Our economic system, pushes these things. The methodologies and the processes of our economic systems don't hinder that. They actually push for these things. And then our economic system is, in my thinking, just simply because it is based on thinking from hundreds of years ago, it is basically masculine by design, and it's ignoring any feminine patterns of managing. So we at our 3.0, we're exploring a lot of new ways of dialoguing, sociocracy as one example. And there are other examples, how a much more democratic way and a much more female-driven way, an equity-driven way of coming to consensus and consent actually looks like. I would also say that our economic system is still nationalistic, while it is intended to be globalized. And we think that we can cure that by trade treaties. I don't think that we can do that. Trade treaties are oppressive by design as well, and then still have a tendency to benefit the Goliath instead of David. I think also that our economic system, we know all that is dependent on perpetual growth and also on perpetual debt. And it's simply ignorant to our planetary boundaries. It's also sick from the whole idea of privatization and the idea of needing to own common goods. So that whole idea of ownership in our world, and that we would have rights from this ownership, is very much based on a sort of very egomaniac way of thinking. And then we try to think we can cure all that by philanthropy. And in my opinion, philanthropy is simply palliative care to a cancerous system. It's not going to cure. It just puts plasters on the wounds and things like that. So these are just a couple of things that I also discuss in quite some depth in the book, to make sure that we understand where all of this comes from. And in our 3.0, we have a visual that we call the triple E failure, where we are taking two steps. The first step is that we describe what's going wrong, and it's mainly three areas that all start with an E. That's why we call it the triple E failure. There is the economic system meltdown, and there are minimally 25 things that go wrong, maybe 1,000 things. There is the ecologic system collapse that we see happening right in front of our eyes. And there is the education system failure, where we see that we don't have the right education to prepare our youth for what's coming. And in my book, I do have a cartoon, the famous fish cartoon. It has gotten viral really all over the world, where it says, Corona is not just our biggest problem. It is just a symptom of the stress of this planet that has been created by this triple E failure. Again, economic system meltdown, ecological system collapse, and education system failure. And so what's already coming, or what we're seeing, apart from another economic crisis that's already on the horizon, there is a resource crisis. There is a climate crisis. there is a biodiversity crisis. And if we're not solving any of this, we will face a human extinction crisis. So that is how I would explain some of the root causes of the stress that we're seeing. And now I forgot your question, Eddie.
Well, actually, when I hear all that, we really need to rethink economics, which is actually our organization.
Absolutely.
So if I summarize, it's colonial, it's oppressive, it's racist, it's masculine, it's nationalistic, it's pushing versus perpetual growth. So we have economic, ecological, and educational failure. What do you propose?
Well, that is exactly what we did at R3.0 right at the start, when we thought about what is this ideal of a regenerative and distributive economy. And I don't have the time to go into depth in all of this. But what we actually did really was, when we went through this exercise, because we were seeing all these things, we first thought about a set of principles that are necessary to define basically what are the characteristics of a regenerative and distributive economy. And there are things like relevance, there are things like mutuality, there are things like circularity, but there's also humbleness. You know, this whole idea of every human being has the right to live in well-being. And this is not what our system offers. Our system divides. So that was the first step. The second step is that we looked at different sort of categories of what defines a regenerative and distributive economy. And we looked at ecological regeneration, we looked at economic regeneration, and we looked at social and cultural regeneration. And we were actually able to really put that on one sheet. And that would be, I would be happy to share that with you afterwards, because that is one of the things that we use many, many times. So just to explain, you know, each of these three categories have like two main subheadings. What defines a regenerative and distributive economy? In the ecological regeneration part, the first would be a regenerative and cyclical economy.
That's interesting, because we teach about circular economy, but you don't agree with that.
No, I don't agree with that. In our perspective, a regenerative and distributive economy by design has to be what we call fractal. So it is a conglomerate of many things. And if you just look at the life cycle of a tree, you would find all of them. So there are processes that are linear, you know, grows. They are partially circular. They are partially cyclical, you know, the rings, the tree rings and all that. And they are partially spiral. So a regenerative and distributive economy has to be a mix of all of these. And it depends.
So linear, circular, spiral.
And cyclical. And if you pull that all together, we would call it fractal. And we've actually described that in one of our blueprints, the value cycles blueprint. And maybe I'll explain, you know, we have 9 of these blueprints in our work ecosystem at R3.0. And the value cycles blueprint was looking at what is of value in a regenerative and distributive economy. Because everybody, again, one of these buzzwords, everybody talks about impact. Well, what is impact? What is it? Without knowing the thresholds and allocations, you will come back to this question again and again and again and again. You can only define if it is a positive or negative impact if you know the thresholds and allocations to them. And that describes what we call system value creation. And that is the translation of intergenerational equity in multi-capital terms. So, you know, this has been thought through in quite a amount of depth. And coming back to that second part of ecological regeneration, we call it long-term resource planning for intergenerational equity. So it's this really that various generations perspective that you need to have when you plan your resource use. And again, how would you know? Through your allocations. based on the thresholds. So these are the two essential things in ecological regeneration that are necessary. If you look at economic regeneration, the second major part or bucket, again, there are two subheadings there. The first one is called a transparent global level playing field measuring system value. So that there are accounting principles that measure what we call the true costs, the true benefits, the true prices. You might have heard about the internalization of external effects into cost accounting. That's the true costing part. But that alone, again, will not get us there. You also need a true benefiting part to describe what is it actually that you're adding. It's not the depreciation, it's the appreciation of what you're doing. That's also needed. And that has to translate into prices. And prices are the basic signal for markets or market mechanisms to work. And now combine that with true taxation, a taxation system that actually benefits sustainability, and true remuneration, so that people are really paid on their system value creation. Then you have what we call those 5 T's: true cost, true benefit, true pricing, true taxation, and true remuneration. You need all of these 5 parts to make a market system work sustainably. And that is what economic regeneration can be like if we do all that together. And then in order to get there, and I mentioned intergenerational equity a couple of times, the second part under this bucket is multi-level decision-making processes to scale up regenerative, distributive, and thriving impacts. And then there are these terms that you mentioned, and now I come to these terms in just a minute, Eddie. But I just wanted to also cover that third bucket. That's the social and cultural regeneration that we also need to adhere to. The first subheading under this bucket is holistic education to develop complex system thinkings and stewardship. Again, another one of those terms coming up here that we will need to look into more deeper. And then the second subheading in this bucket is governance systems for thriving and flourishing. Integral governance structures that create a pull towards a regenerative and distributive economy. Our current governance system do the opposite. They're not getting us there. They are running behind the facts. And now I come to these terms, and now you heard a couple of these terms. I mentioned the term stewardship. And that is what in a regenerative and distributive economy replaces leadership. Leadership is an old term from the old normal. It is the big testosterone-driven idea of ruling over people. Very often with schmoozy terms, schmoozy programs, enforcement, and all of those things. But what becomes really important in a regenerative and distributive economy is that you understand that as a steward of an organization, you are first part of a bigger whole. You're not leading. You're part of a bigger whole, and that has consequences for the way how you manage an organization. And another term that we use very much, and really is a reflection of what regeneration and thrivability really means, is the term rights holdership. You now hear an awful lot about, we're gone away from shareholder primacy and we need stakeholder primacy. Honestly speaking, stakeholder primacy is a prolongation of shareholder primacy. In the end, what still counts is that the shareholder gets their money. Mm-hmm. And that the stakeholder part of that makes sure that nothing awfully happens. But what we mean is that if you think to be a steward, you need to accept that everything on this planet has a right to exist. Everything on this planet you owe duties and obligations to, just simply because you exist as an organization. You have these duties and obligations, and you have to fulfill them. Otherwise, your license to operate and your license to growth need to be legally taken away from you. And that is, in all consequence, what is going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. 70% of all multinationals that exist today will cease to exist in the next 20 years. 70%. Those figures are known. And that has an awful lot of reasons. Of course, there is technology changes and all of these other things. But if you now read the climate impacts on companies already happening today, we've just seen the peak of the iceberg. How's it called in English?
The top of the iceberg.
The top of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. So, we know what's coming. The question is, we have all the knowledge. We just need to change and transform individually. Everybody, it all starts with ourselves. And I can only tell you my life story and how I've changed over time.
Ralph, I know you're a big fan of Plato, the Greek philosopher.
Yes, right.
You also mentioned him in your book. Maybe you can share that as a kind of guideline for yourself, I guess.
Yeah. Plato has been very helpful in the idea of clarifying a lot of language bullshit that companies are using very often when they talk about well-being. They talk about housing well-being, and they talk about health and well-being. There are three terms that we need to differentiate. There is wellness, there is welfare, and there is well-being. And what has been guiding me in the term of intergenerational equity is Plato's explanation of well-being, where he says, the one can only be well unless the whole is well.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. The one can only be well unless the whole is well. So that means there is no individual well-being when others suffer. There is no economic system success when others suffer. That means we can reach well-being together as a human species, and only together, but not individually. And that is why Plato is so important for the sort of giving the idea of what the ideal of a regenerative and distributive economy and what thriving really means.
I'm going to finish this first part of the interview, by asking you this question. Suppose we're in 2050, maybe it's too long. We're in 2040, and your dream has come true. We have transformed our economy, the way we relate and organize ourselves. We all live in a regenerative and thriving society within the ecological boundaries of our planet. The new normal is achieved. How do you think such a world will look like? What will be then the main characteristics of such a society?
Well, I have two basic ideas. One is just simply looking at the characteristics of a regenerative and distributive economy. And I've already mentioned a couple of that. So understanding the terms and really acting upon them is, of course, the first one. A second one is that we have undergone a major, what I would call the big detoxification. And I mean that in various terms. First of all, I'm thinking about degrowth, which actually doesn't mean no growth, but other types of growth. For example, I want, if I look at the different capitals, I want human capital growth. I want social capital growth. I want intellectual capital growth. I want natural capital growth, but I don't want financial growth on the back of these other parts of the multi-capital perspective. I want a deglorification of stuff, and that we come to something where we share things with each other and we're not owning things. I want a decreasing of ecological abuse. as we see it. Just look into Siberia, look into Alaska, look into Brazil, and all of these things. I want a decolonization of space and culture, which has been a pattern for the last decennia. I want de-masculinity and sort of finding the feminine genius in our economic thinking and really develop that sort of balance idea, and to be for the whole, which we testosterone-driven males are just not able to think of. And I want the deprivatization of common goods, so that that detoxification can lead to what is in medical terms called a homeostasis, a state of a steady internal physical and chemical condition that is maintained by a living system. So that is one part. Another important part is that whole aspect of localization. We have seen that how toxic globalization is, and we're already seeing there are thousands of projects around the world where people try to define a so-called bioregion. And even some of my colleagues work and live in bioregions. And we, as R3.0, we have come across this whole bioregional thinking first in 2015 when John Fullerton was speaking at our conference. And he was asking us a very critical question. And it was around, how do you measure success? And he said, the basic question that you need to ask yourself before you actually start thinking about that, what's the unit of measurement? How do you define a unit of measurement in which you can measure success? And he said, it's the bioregion. It's not the company. It's not a national state or a country. It's a naturally defined bioregion. So that whole perspective.
Between rivers or
watersheds is a typical example of defining bioregions. Mountain ranges can divide bioregions. So there are many, many different things. And that whole idea of localization and building those hubs for that, and then thinking about, how can they live substantially a decent and fair share life from what they have. And only then you start to think about what is a different sort of governance that you would need, where the exchange between those bioregions becomes important, and where they learn from each other in peace, of course. All of this is peaceful. That is what's needed. It's not trade treaties. It's not globalization. It's localization. And then the last part, what I would really want to think about is that idea of, and I mentioned it already, ownership. One of the biggest problems in today's economic system logic is that we are valued by what we own. And part of what we own is property. So the illusion of separation that happens there continues in this stereotype thinking of ownership. If I own a place, I can do whatever I want. No need to render an account to anybody of that. And owning property actually goes back to the feudal ages, and then reclaimed by the people in the Renaissance, and it's now administered by public authorities and then sold to private persons or companies or trusts, and then finally shuffled around amongst these. All these transactions come with specific conditions, like property obliges. That's one of them. It's actually one of the things in the German constitution that people constantly ignore. And that is also something that we have learned the hard way in Corona, just to make that transition to what we can learn from Corona. This whole idea of people, and especially in the Netherlands, and it really confuses me. There's this constant shouting for people's rights. I have the right to do this, and I have the right to do that. I have the right to not wear a mask. I have the right to not vaccinate. I have the right to this and I have the right to that. One thing that we can learn from Plato is that your rights end where it actually decreases the rights of others. That's a part of well-being, or the idea of well-being. So with rights always come with responsibilities. And that is where what we in the Northern world tend to forget all the time, because we're always told that we have rights. But again, there is no right without responsibility. So that whole idea of ownership and is just one example of all of this discussion about rights and thinking to have rights. And technically speaking, if you ask me, what I told about these buckets and this sort of regenerative distributive economy on one page, and what I said about the 5 T's: true costing, true benefiting, true pricing, true remuneration, true taxation. Those are just technical parts of how future market mechanisms can actually work. And they are not capitalist. It's not a capitalist system in that sense. It is owned by all of us, and it's done on sociocracy terms and other terms, which are based on a proper discussion and decision-making process, which is unfortunately not what politics do.
So we have to rethink politics.
This
is another discussion.
I think we need, honestly speaking, I think at a certain point we need to abandon the idea of politics.
Now, talking about abandoning, I would like to involve the audience. The next part. You shared with us a lot of your insights. I have 2 questions for the audience, for which I would like you to use the chat box. I'm going to ask Xenia to share a first question to you all. And I think Ralph also answered the question, but now I want to see what your point of view is. In order to move towards a regenerative and distributive economy that brings us to a thriving society and within a thriving planet, what are, according to the audience, ideas and assumptions in our current economics thinking that no longer serve us, that we should let go? So, and use the chat box for that. So we're not gonna use the mic. So what do you believe are things we should let go? So short-termism in corporate and political governance, okay? So we should start thinking long-term and not a short-term profit maximization. We should let go, he says, limited liability. We should let go greed. We should let go individualism. We should let go sticking to the known. So what about the younger people following this webinar? What do you believe we should let go? Patsimo, the human superiority complex. That's a nice one. We should let go workers in a supermarket. Profit maximization, redefining state as an institution, individualism, egoism. We should let go property and ownership. Growth is only money, so we should have different forms of growth. We were going to stop of what we need to let go, and now I would like to see words from you or sentences. What should we add? What should we introduce in our, between brackets, economic thinking in order to move towards a regenerative and thriving society? What should we add? We should add shared value thinking, equity, shared responsibility, social and mental health, progress for humanity, nature, and all that we need to be in a thriving society. Whole system bioregional design. We should add diversity, introduce investment in human and natural capital,
We should introduce experimentability culture. So experiment. What else should we add? We need to look at ourselves as adaptable human beings. We should learn to think as a collective society. We should introduce love for people, the earth, everything. More money for world health. We should add creativity. We should add culture and art being more appreciated than it is today. We should add humanity and creative positive awareness to the public. Creativity in moving towards renewable materials and resources. Okay. So quite a lot of things we need to let go and some things we need to add. Ralph, when you see that, anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, of course, and I don't want to spoil too much, but I have a sheet in my book where I have, you can't see it really, but I just want to share it. There's a whole page of what to let go of and what to pick up on. And a lot of the things that you've been mentioning are on that list. And what I actually like most of what we should focus on is love. That really is a very important one. It is one of those where managers get pickles from. It's one of those things that are sort of like not done in normal business life. And I can share that I'm part of an initiative. It's called the Scale of Significance here in the Netherlands, that has actually started off from the idea, can we make love visible, and can we make love a guiding principle of the way how we collaborate with each other? And it has developed a whole approach around that and is now scaling up and has done a couple of pilot tests for that, which were extremely exciting because they were very revealing. And actually, in the book itself, I have devoted a whole chapter to the issue of love as part of constituting factors of a regenerative and distributive or thriving world. And that, to me, is a very important one.
In order to work on that a bit, we're gonna go into breakout rooms where we can share our love for each other and also for your ideas. So we believe it's important not only to listen to an inspiring man that Ralph for sure is, but also to exchange our own point of view of it. So what's going to happen now is that we will share 2 questions, which we ask you to answer in breakout rooms. Don't worry, we'll put you automatically in breakout rooms. We kindly invite you to really do and go for that exercise. I know that sometimes people say, I don't want to be in it, but do it because it's quite inspiring. And it's also putting yourself in the spotlights and also sharing your ideas because they're all very valuable. So the 2 questions we would like to take you into the breakout rooms are the following. What parts of Ralph ideas resonate with you? You've heard a lot from 5 Ps, triple E's, and also a lot of other stuff. So what are the things that resonate with you? And then secondly, which is certainly as important, how would you apply these ideas in your own personal life or in your own personal context? So welcome back, all of you in the main session. We hope we had a nice chat in the breakout room.
Too short.
Too short again? I do my best.
It's never long enough for Joris, I can tell.
I know.
Well, we were only with 3, so.
We were just getting started.
Oh,
literally.
good to see you.
I'm not alone.
No, it was so interesting though.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a bit of feedback. So from each breakout room, someone starts. Just what were the insights? What did you take from it? And maybe you still have a question for Ralph if he wasn't in your room. So who would like to start?
I see Neil's hand is going up.
Yeah.
Neil.
I sought the permission of my group to do a summary, and we summarized before we came back. So this is on behalf of Vivian, Chiara, Sophia, and Tiago that were in our group. We had a wonderful conversation, and first of all, Vivian was very pleased, as she comes from Kenya in the global south, to have heard the voices of us here and the conversation that's happening, actually recognizing the problems in the global south and looking at trying to do something about that from here. She's had feet on the ground in Kenya and feet on the ground in Afghanistan. She's concerned about the reporting that goes on and what's actually happening as opposed to what's being reported. And so there's a potential distortion of the messages that are coming through for the global north. And so finding better ways of reporting that is really, really important to her. And she was very pleased to hear that we can be both helping to represent that, but also allowing her voice to be heard. So I'm hoping I'm giving that true honouring. Chiara was saying that coming from Italy, she sees that they had what she regards as a better recycling system in Italy. And she was saying she was only a student, but she could see ways of improving the recycling system. And we said she's not only a student, she has some agency, and that her opportunity is to say if she can see something to change, then that's the way to start small and then build out from there. Tiago was saying similar, he could see barriers from the existing system, and Ralph discussed many of those, quite often by the dominant culture and the dominant paradigm, and it was very difficult to see how to make a difference as an individual. And again, in the group, we were discussing how we might build on that to add to have the conversations required to then self-organize with slightly larger groups and larger groups building agency as you go forward. And if I'm summarizing correctly, Sophia then said that from her perspective, she sees a lot of issues and videos on YouTube and various other places that talk about how we're measuring indicators for corporations, but she doesn't see the real progress type indicators that Ralph was talking about. So very keen to see those real progress indicators coming through, that we're really measuring what really matters, given the difficulties we're in. And just to wrap that up for the others in the group here, Anne and I are quite close to Eddie and Xenia and to Ralph in terms of very much agreement with the sort of things that Ralph's been discussing from our own experience in our own longer lives than most here. Difficulties in getting reporting, difficulties in getting better sustainability outcomes, not measuring the right things, resistance to change, patriarchal systems, all of the things that Ralph was talking about. So strong endorsement from us, Ralph, on the sort of work you're doing and the sort of work that we might assist with. And thanks very much to our group of youngers for listening to us and for contributing to our thinking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Neil.
Thank you for that feedback. Can we hear another group, please?
I would like to hear the young people speaking, because you had many more young attendees, which is good. I like that.
Yeah, I was actually in the first group that had a lot of young people as well. And Chab, I also call you young, so
he will be happy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm delighted.
And I have written up a couple of things that came up in our discussion, and I'm happy to report back on them if you allow. Hernando was talking about, and that came up actually twice or so. Shemaya came up with that, the idea of self-sufficiency, and really trying to grow your own food as much as that is possible when the season allows it. And Shemaya said she's living in the countryside, so where that is possible. And we just started to talk about exchanging stuff in the community that is bioregionally based, and where you actually seek to try to buy locally produced food directly from the producer as well. Something that we also do here in the Netherlands, where we live. So that thing came up a couple of times. Then Chab, who's also working in academia, and especially also in the world of finance, he agreed that even in the finance sector, there's this restriction to variables and proxies that doesn't really show the whole picture. And from that perspective, there is the need for better information in the financial system. And of course, my plea is for thresholds and allocations there as well, because they are possible. But he also said, what he's doing is that he really, while doing the typical financial research, he does research for SMEs a lot in Finland, because that's where he teaches, that are following sustainability, and he prefers those over others. And in the courses that he's actually offering, he has sustainability as an intended work outcome. So it is something that he introduces, even if it's like a hardcore financial course. So there's a lot that individuals can actually do. And another thing that was mentioned was that whole idea of the pricing mechanisms. So sustainable taxation came up as a topic that can have a huge influence. And then also, of course, really to sell sustainable stuff really purposefully. And but the best sustainability solution very often is not to buy at all, because we all have so much and it's all still good. And we don't give a fucking damn about what the current mode is. We are, that's not what defines us. And that is part of being a positive maverick, that you withstand this idea of these trends very much. So some of us in the group were doing that as well. So I'm going to stop here to give others a chance to speak.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I'm glad you called Chap a youngster. He will be very happy about that.
You should have said the youngest.
The youngest. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can say I was in the group with Fiona, Rawlings, Matteo, and Pauline. They liked the 3 E's. They liked the new insights. Matteo was a bit scared when he heard you talking, Ralph, but he was also hopeful. Mm-hmm. And also the word love sticked really very much into people's heads and minds. What they told me, I was the oldest in the group, that one of the ladies finds the old generation courageous if we dare to speak up. We should speak up more. We should speak up more, and we should take our stand, knowing it's perhaps difficult for us to do so, but we should do it. And there was one question that popped up. You mentioned abandoning politics. And so they asked me, what does he mean with it? So I'm going to ask you that question right away.
Well, it's really abandoning politics. It means, does politics or is politics and the political institutions and the processes that do exist, are they capable to get us in the right direction? You see all these court cases against governments at this moment are truly telling us you seem to not be able to. You're seeing Fridays for Future on the streets, and then politicians say, yeah, that's nice, but we need experts. Experts need to do that. It's the total ignorance against the younger generations that politics is normally expressing, because they are not the voters. They are not the ones that consume most. They are not the ones lobbying for certain things. So all of that is sort of like toned down as unimportant. So do we really think that this sort of politics is going to solve any of our problems? So in my perspective, I doubt it. And then, to not further scare you, we do see how those things can actually be solved. If you think of a regenerational approach, a bioregional approach, and I see that we have examples in Colombia, for example. We have a colleague of mine who works in the Connecticut River Valley bioregion, and how they discuss what's necessary, how they find ways to make decisions. So the whole idea of pro-social, David Sloan Wilson, the whole idea of sociocracy processes, Ted Rao, these are all sort of popping up as new ways to create sort of dialogue that also allows governance to actually evolve over time. And what I see very often is that we do see sort of like a parallel universe already starting to take shape. And at a certain moment, politics doesn't play a role in that any longer.
So communities take over, self-regulative.
Yeah. And I have a huge discussions with my brother, who's a member of the Green Party in Germany, who just couldn't believe I say that. But sometimes it has to, but it has to be as radical sometimes as it needs to be. Again, doing what's necessary.
Okay, thank you for that. We still have, I think, 2 groups we didn't hear.
Well, maybe we should have either Agnieszka or difficult to read your name, Fatsimo.
Fatsimo.
You want to talk? Fatsimo.
Yeah. It's Fatsimo. I describe it to people. I say Pat C. So and
okay.
Yeah, Fatsimo. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I think I had misunderstood one of the points that Ralph had pointed out about more feminist economic thinking, and it had been pointed out to me, and I think I have a better understanding. But other than that, I think the one thing that stuck out the most to me about our conversation was how he said that we need to unlearn before we can relearn. I mean, for the older generations, because I've also had so many discussions about my mom, like with my mom about things, not even like just this topic, just like so many different things, and you have completely different views. And I think the difference between my mom and me is that I'm definitely more willing to accept that I may be wrong about things, and that you know, the things that I'm saying now aren't necessarily completely right, because I'm a human being, I make mistakes, and other than that, people have opinions that may be more valid than mine. And I think my mom struggles a lot more with that concept of like not being right, and it's something that I've seen with a lot of people just in her generation. Yeah, that's just something that I really like, that resonated with me. Just like, I think I have a better understanding now of like why those conversations never really end well. So yeah.
Take her to one of our lectures. Okay, thank you, Fatsimo, for sharing that. Maybe someone else from the group or the other group we didn't hear, I think, because we have a couple of minutes left.
Well, I would like to share thoughts from my group. We were Huda, Ashley, and Marlo. I would first take a step back and take a look on the statement of Mr. Ralph's father. Unfortunately, in my country, there's a lot less knowledge about this topic. And so we all agree that we should speak up, speak louder, have more of these discussions where we share our experiences, and we share basically we point out that the crisis is really, really big. And unfortunately, things, if we do not do something soon, are going to be even worse in our lifetime, not to mention our children's lifetime. So also I would take a look back to the governments and companies. We also agree that's like an endless loop, just they're supporting each other and hiding the real statistics, as somebody mentioned, and the real things just for profit. So we definitely must do something about that. That's the start, that's the base, the core, because the government should do first of all good, not covering everything. So those are the short things. Thank you.
Yeah. And may I ask which country you come from?
Serbia.
Serbia.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think we heard all the groups, or did I miss a group? I did not. Okay. Ralph, it's almost 10 o'clock. Maybe some last comments, or maybe some urgent questions still from the audience?
Well, if there are no questions, maybe because love came up a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to share, an anecdote here. I have this whole chapter in my book about, love as the ultimate cure. The way how to feel and give love in an economic system is just so awkward. And what I've been writing, and I'm just reading this here from the book, love is the ultimate expression of doing well. If you try to embed an idea like love in today's market context, and for businesses, how they could safeguard love, you will be met with raised eyebrows. My most funny encounter when I asked this question in a company meeting, and the answer was, we give away free condoms during the carnival season. But normally, relationships aren't allowed in our organization. So when those cases happen, we expect one side to actually leave the company. This is as far as it gets at this moment. And love in current business context is just not a good thing. And that needs to completely change. The whole idea of what I mentioned around Plato is actually an expression of love, if you take it seriously. And then, making love visible is a way to start to cure around that. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as we know. So from that perspective, that's what the chapter in the book really takes a look at. So I want you to love and not just privately. I want you to love everything and everybody. So from that perspective, I think that's maybe a good way to end that session.
Wow. I'm going to ask everybody, Xenia, can we organize it that we see a full screen with everybody on it so that we can...
Yeah, you cannot see more than what you see now.
There is no way to have the whole... You can have a few speakers galleries. I have a gallery view now. We have Tiago, Agnieszka, Marilou.
Yeah. I think what we can already do is we just ask everybody to go on camera.
Yeah.
So that we have this first full, yeah, great. They're coming on board. For whoever is still there, just for a moment, so that we can do a screenshot and have you all on at least on one of the photos.
And we are 27, so there are 2 persons that are on the second screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and I'm going to ask you all to unmute and to give a very warm applause for Ralph for this wonderful evening. Ralph, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ralph.
We all sing, all we need is love.
All we need is love.
All we need is love. All we need is love.
All we need is love.
Love is all you need.
Love is all you need.
There we go.
And just sharing this, a bit of publicity for Ralph.
Thank you very much.
If you are interested in his book and his organization, the book is also available at the KDG library.
Yes, it is, indeed.
You can also purchase it. And it's also, you have the websites, his professional website, r3.o, also his private website, aheadahead.earth. Thank you all very much. I wish you a great evening, and let's spread the word and let's love each other, the planet, and everything that is alive on it.
Thank you very
much. Xenia. Bye.
A big hug to all of you.
Yeah. See you.